Hey, welcome, Pete. How are you?
I'm fine, Rob. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. If you don't mind, I'd like to just jump right into this thing, given the disappointing loss last night by the Cleveland Cavaliers. 40 plus years throughout the NBA. You were obviously with the Cavaliers during the culminating in the successful 2016 championship. If you were looking at this team, let's start from a scout perspective. What would you have done differently if you were on that bench for the Cavs?
Well, first of all, I've been retired since 2016, so I have you probably know more about the team than I do today, the current team. Uh, the only player that's left was Tristan Thompson from my days,
Yep.
uh, and he doesn't play a lot, so I'm no expert on where they are today. I would just say from the outside looking in, the fact that they had the best record in the NBA, it's hard to say that they should have been doing things differently. The fact I have a brother who is still working the league, works with the Bucks, and at one point in the season, he thought Cleveland like basically had all the bases covered. They had interior defense, they could protect the rim, they had perimeter scoring, mid-range scoring, they had guys that could post up. They just didn't have many weaknesses at all. So, the playoffs were kind of a shock to watch from my perspective because going into it, and I hadn't watched them play hardly at all during the year, but so that's in my mindset going in, and then watching them play against Indiana was a little bit shocking to me. So I don't know what I would have done differently. Again, because you know more about the team today than I do.
Well, let me ask you this from your perspective, both scouting, coaching, and as a GM. How do you feel about, they rested guys a lot during the season. Do you see any upside or downside to doing that?
When I was working, we didn't even know what load management was. We no, but if you said that term, people would ask, "Well, what does that mean?" Because it just didn't happen. Um, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong. We just never knew about it. So it just you didn't rest your players. It was really unusual if you sat them down. You may cut their minutes back a little bit if you're right at the very end of the season, but not you don't change much of what you're doing. At least we didn't in those days. So Pop got the whole thing started, I think, years ago in San Antonio, and got some heat from the league for doing it because star players weren't playing on the road, and which is unfair to those fans on the road because they're paying to see in those days Tim Duncan or David Robinson or whoever it may be. Um, so the league had a legitimate point. Um, so you know, I don't know if if I'm comfortable with I don't have a definitive position on load management. Um, I just know that we never did it, and we seem to be fine in the playoffs. I, I guess you could argue that when you go to load management, you might change your rhythm, you might change, what's going on with your team in terms of, we used to love to play every other day in the playoffs and not have more than a day off in between, but that was kind of the rhythm you got into, and I think the same thing with load management is maybe it throws you off that rhythm because now you've got a different starting lineup, you've got different minutes on the floor, and now you're going to go back to it. Um, I would pose that as a question more than as some definitive answer as to whether it's good or bad.
Well, when it comes to load management, I think you probably created the only court, we'll say, or home field advantage in the NBA when you were with Denver. I think you called it, what was it, the altitude?
Well, we were really lucky because Doug Moe was our coach, who gets doesn't get enough recognition for how good he was, but he was really unorthodox. When I went to Denver, Doug was the coach already when I got there, and So I knew he was close to Dean Smith. So I read Dean Smith's books and all this before I was actually stepped on the floor. Was at practice in Denver, and thinking, well, that would give me some insight into how Doug runs his passing game. Had nothing like Dean Smith whatsoever. I mean, literally nothing like it. It was just, but it was so simple. It was basically pass and cut, don't stand still. We didn't screen, he didn't have cutters going a certain direction. It's just like when you caught the ball, you either had a shot immediately, you drove it immediately, or you passed it immediately. Doug would lose his mind if you held the ball for 10 seconds. I mean, it's like, it's like stop, everybody stops moving. So he wanted that constant motion, and he was great at coaching it. So in Denver, we ran like crazy, baseline to baseline. Every practice, that's how we practiced the game, full court. We did very little half court work. Almost everything was baseline to baseline, and we could run people off the floor, and accentuate the fact that we were at high altitude. I remember we played Houston a few times in the playoffs, well, even during the regular season. And Olajuwon they'd call ahead and ask for oxygen to be on the bench, behind the bench. Well, so we would go to the extreme. We would put a whole line of oxygen things behind the bench, right? So psychologically, it was like playing with guys' minds. And I can remember when Dan Ehlo was playing against Olajuwon, we'd run extra hard that first quarter, and you have to get your second wind at that altitude. And when you get your second wind, you're fine. But players have sometimes a hard time thinking psychologically through to that second wind. And I can remember Ehlo would lean over on the free throw lane next to Olajuwon, and say something like, I live here and I can't breathe at all. I don't know how you can breathe. And Olajuwon would be saying to waving to Bill Fitch, hey, sit me down. I gotta have some oxygen. So just playing those mind games, and there's a physical attribute to it, because the air is thinner. Yep. But once you get your second wind, if you're a highly trained athlete or a conditioned athlete, you're going to be all right. But it's getting through to that second wind. So the years in Denver were fun because we overachieved every year. Doug got the most out of the players that we had, and we kept pretty good stability. We didn't make many changes from year to year, so the guys understood the system and what Doug expected. So it was out of all our stops, that probably was one of our favorite stops.
So you mentioned that run, shoot. It sounds a lot like what the Pacers did in the playoffs to the Cavs. It seemed like, there was constant movement. They were constantly, somebody moving away from the defense to the open spot, and miraculously the ball hit them right in the chest, and there they were ready to shoot.
Yeah. It's a hard game to defend if you do it properly. Teams would come in and scout us like crazy, and Doug would be walking down the sidelines and he'd see scouts sitting there from other teams. The Lakers were particularly I think Pat was a little obsessed with, how we played. So Randy Funn was an assistant with him, and Randy would come up and see us play a lot. And Doug would make comments to Randy, is like, I see you writing stuff down there. If you figure out what we're doing, you just let me know, okay? Because I don't have a clue, what's going to happen. Because it really was that open. I mean, it was literally pass and cut, don't stand still. And here's a great example. Alex English. It's a great trivia question. He was the leading scorer in the entire NBA for the 1980s. For that 10-year period, he scored more points than any other player. Alex was not a three-point shooter. He wasn't really a great one-on-one player, but he was so smart. His intelligence was off the charts as a person and a player. So he knew if he kept moving, teammates were going to get him the ball for that 15-foot floating jump shot he had, or a layup, and didn't take a three-point shot, didn't go one-on-one, and scored more points than anybody else in the 1980s. And the system helped with that.
It's amazing that you brought that up, because I was just going to follow up with a question that on those Denver teams, I mean, Alex English Hall of Fame, but how underappreciated is he?
Well, he should. I mean, he's in the Hall of Fame, obviously, but you don't hear his name mentioned a whole lot when you talk about the great players. And he was such an intelligent player as well as a talented player. So you couple those together. He didn't take bad shots, and but you look up at the scoreboard, and all of a sudden he's got 30, 35 points. You go, like, where did that come from? Because he did it so quietly, because he wasn't monopolizing the ball. He didn't have the ball in his hands all the time. Um, he just was a remarkable player. And that team had a number of underrated players. Fat Lever was our point guard, and Fat, I think he had more triple doubles than anybody except Magic. Phenomenal rebounder, great hands. Would lead the league in steals, or our team would lead the league in steals. We had T.R. Dunn and Fat and Elson Turner as kind of a 3-guard rotation, and those 3 guys could shut people down. And people would talk about Doug's teams not being very good defensively, but I would always take issue with that. I mean, we were really good defensively, and Doug stressed defense, but that was simple too. I remember a coach asking me, like a 5-star coach one day, asked me about what's Doug's defensive philosophy, and I said, well, it's just real simple. You pick up the ball at half court, you pressure the ball like crazy, you deny everything one pass away. And if you see somebody that needs help, you help them out. Don't worry about getting beat back door. You deny that pass, that guard forward pass. You get beat back door, it's not going to happen that often. Somebody needs help them out. That was like the defensive playbook. And this 5-star coach looked at me and he says, "Oh, you just don't want to tell me what it really is, right?" I said, "No, I'm telling you, it's the truth. It's not any more complicated than that. It's just simple, basic basketball." But Doug expected you to do it and do it well, and we had the players who could achieve that. So, like I said, we overachieved every year.
What led you into this life I mean, look, I'm not sure how many people have been a volunteer coach or scout and went all the way up to minority owner, right? You were part owner of the
Right.
Nuggets, right?
Yeah, a small part, but
Yes,
yes.
but hey, it counts.
Yeah, right.
So, what led you into the basketball life?
Well, I played in high school and I played in junior college for 2 years, and then I wasn't a big time player. I was an overachiever, and I had 9 or 10 offers to go to smaller schools, but I made a decision at that point. I was real active, um, with things that are going on in the country, the civil rights movement, the um, the anti-war protests that were going on were getting my attention more and more each year, and so I was, in my mind, was very politically active. So I thought, basketball is just a game. I'm just gonna let it go at this point. So I went to Arizona State, majored in political science. My master plan was go to law school, get my law degree, use that as a vehicle to help me in a political career, and I would run for Congress and make the world a better place. So that was the idealism in my head. Well, I went to law school for 1 week. At the end of literally 1 week, I thought, I have no passion for this. I can't do this for 3 years. And I really didn't know what to do at that point. But I knew one thing that I loved was basketball, but I didn't have a lot of outlets for it. What am I going to do? I'm not going to play anymore. So I went
Right.
back to Phoenix. This was in Arizona. It was at U of A, University of Arizona Law School. Moved back up to Phoenix. Went to my old high school. I asked the coach if I could volunteer to be his assistant for the year. He let me volunteer, and I worked as a substitute teacher, and had a great time. I loved it. So it kind of told me I'm going the right direction. Now that wasn't the NBA, but it was just basketball. In the meantime, Phoenix Suns had come to town in 1968, and my teammates and I would go down when I was in junior college and see games. And I remember sitting there thinking, if I could do anything in the world, this is what I would do. I would coach, work in the NBA. Had no idea how to get there. This is a long-winded answer, but so I I saved my money and bought a videotape machine when they first came out. Great big monster machines, great big tapes, and I started taping every NBA game that was on TV, which in those days wasn't a lot. Phoenix Suns were on all their games were on, and then the game of the week on the weekend, whatever televised. But you didn't have all the streaming or the cable stuff we have today. But anyway, so I videotaped all these games, and I studied the tapes and broke down the tapes. So I charted their offensive sets, special situations, out of bounds plays, notes on players, strengths and weaknesses, trying to learn about the NBA for kind of like an inside look at it. At the end of the year, I had this file cabinet full of these reports I'd written on teams. And so I thought, well, people who will know if they're any good would be the teams themselves. So I wrote a letter with no computers or email in those days. I write a letter to each GM and head coach that I had a report on. I didn't have every team, but the teams that I had reports on. And I said, you don't know me. I'm a high school coach. I live in Phoenix, Arizona. Here's the report I wrote on your team this year. If you think there's any merit to it, it's any good, I'm willing to volunteer to scout for your team for free. Teams come through to play the Suns. I'll go down, scout them for free, write the report. I'll mail it to you for free. And, it'll give me experience and give you the information. Most teams didn't write back. A few wrote me nice notes back and said thanks, but no thanks. The New Orleans Jazz said, be our guest. If you're going to scout for free, go ahead. Elgin Baylor was the head coach. Bill Burka was the GM at that time, and worked for them for 2 years for free. Kept coaching in high school, same time. But then when I'm down in the arena regularly, I'm sitting at the table, with full-time NBA people who are traveling around, coaches, scouts, GMs. And one guy in particular sat with me regularly. He was Jack McCloskey, who was assistant coach with Jerry West with the Lakers. And he would fly over pretty regularly because it was a 45-minute flight, and he could get the red eye back home and be in practice the next day. So he came over, saw a lot of games, and he calls me out of the blue one day after we got to be friends, and he offers me a job. Says, we'll pay you $50 a game. I know you're not making anything right now, but we'll give you $50 a game, and I don't have to fly to LA or fly to Phoenix anymore. You can do it for me and just do the reports. So that developed into a 2-year process working with Jack and the Lakers when Jerry West was the head coach. And then opportunity came up with the Bucks 2 years later to be a regional scout. And then 2 years later, Paul Silas got the head job in San Diego, and Paul Westfall, Don Nelson were instrumental in helping me get an interview with Silas because I didn't know Paul. And he hired me to be an assistant coach, and so that's how. It's a long answer, but that's how it all came about.
Well, that's so. So the first job was the Lakers. That was paid job, and then you ended up in San Diego, and David Stern was the owner, correct? Or no?
You're thinking of Donald Sterling.
Donald Sterling. I'm sorry.
Well, the first year I worked for Irv Levin. So
Okay.
Irv's the one who made the famous switch of franchises. He owned the Boston Celtics. He was a West Coast guy. He wanted a team on the West Coast. They obviously, league was not going to move the Boston Celtics by any stretch of the imagination. So he switches franchises with Buffalo, with John Y. Brown. They trade franchises. He moves the Buffalo Braves to San Diego, renames them the Clippers. So I worked for Irv for 1 year, and then Sterling bought the team my second year that I was there.
Was it as tumultuous as we hear, in the media reports?
Probably more so.
Can you give us a little insight on that without you can change the names to protect
yeah, it was bizarre, absolutely bizarre. Oh boy, there's so many stories. Don, I remember, called the office one day, and because he kept he lived in LA and have his office on Wilshire Boulevard and in Los Angeles. He would drive down to home games. And he calls one day and he says, I'm looking at the budget, and I see we spent a lot of money on tape, for ankles and stuff. And I said, yeah. And he said, look, I've got a friend who owns a sporting goods store. cancel all those orders, and I'll just bring a box of tape in the trunk of my car when I come down to the game. So I said, well, Don, we use a box of tape every day. You know, I mean, it's going to take a whole lot more than a box of tape coming down to home games. And he said, so he says, well, can you reuse it? I said, no, when you cut it off an ankle, you can't, there's no way of reusing this. I mean, it doesn't work that way. I would spend like 30 minutes having this conversation that was a total waste of time. And I don't know if he was being facetious about, you know, or he was being serious. I don't know, but he acted like he was serious. He had these luncheons. He buys the team. He markets himself rather than the players. So on the side of buses and billboards, there's this picture of Don Sterling holding a basketball. Like, none of the fans care what the owner looks like, right? But so no players were in these advertisements, all the owner. And then he had these monthly or semi-monthly luncheons for professionals in town. He had one for doctors, he had one for lawyers, trying to sell season tickets, you know, and so he'd have us as a staff come to the luncheons and be available to, you know, have conversations with people over there. But he would get up and speak, and he would just ramble. So one time he's given I don't know if it was the first year. I think maybe it was the first year he owned the team. I may have the years mixed up. But he gets up there and he's talking to this group, and he's going, you know, we could make a trade to improve our team. Like, we could get Paul Westphal, which I had never heard this conversation in my life. I was like, we can? What? You know, it's like, he said, we can get Paul Westphal, but do we want to really do that? He was just talking to himself in front of this whole crowd, and he says, you know, if we do that, maybe we win 3-4 more games. Do we really want to win? I mean, wouldn't it be better if we just lose all of our games and have a better draft pick? And so the league fines him heavily, you know, for saying this publicly. He denies that he says it. That night on television, on the sports reports, the media was there at the luncheon. So they filmed him, right? So then they have him on film saying, I never said that. So that night they show the two films. They show him one saying, I never said that. And then they come back and they play the film of him saying exactly that. I mean, well, these are the kind of things that you dealt with.
Unbelievable.
I remember getting a phone call from our accounting office, like in January, and our accountant said, don't cash your paycheck because it's not any good. I said, okay. You know, it's like, some of us have bills to pay, you know, and all this. And he said, well, you know, as soon as we have money in the bank, we'll let you know. You know, it was like, so when you ask, you know, was it as chaotic as news reports? Yeah, probably more so.
Yeah, and those are the stories you're willing to tell, right?
Right. Yeah.
But, you know, you mentioned a potential trade for Westphal there.
Yeah.
You know, during your career, you've obviously been involved in a lot of transactions or potentially transactions. I mean, I can't think of anything more high pressure for an executive than to decide whether to or to make the trade. How did you handle the pressure that comes along with that?
Well, I think you just have to, in your mind, you have to make a decision. I'm going to do what's right for the franchise, regardless of what the blowback is. And I was involved with some controversial trades. You know, when we traded Dominique Wilkens away from the Hawks, and that's a whole story unto itself. But it's a trade we didn't want to make, but we were kind of forced our hand because he was going to be a free agent, and it got really complicated. But you know, and I think half the fans understood why we made the trade, and half of them still. If I'm down in Atlanta and I'm walking in the arena, all these years later, I'll have somebody stop me and say, I don't understand, why'd you ever trade Dominique Wilkens? Like, oh, look, it's a long story. You know, it's like, yeah, I don't have time to tell you the whole story, but yeah, you just have to do what you think is the best interest of the franchise. You can't really be concerned about reaction. It's like same thing with a draft. I mean, when you draft a player, you can't draft a player for that initial public reaction. So like one time in Atlanta, we passed on Harold Miner and we took Adam Keefe from Stanford, and I got booed like crazy when we made the, went down in front of the fans and made the pick. I mean, they all booed me and they were yelling Harold Miner's name because he was known as Baby Jordan.
Yep.
And sure enough, Harold Miner played for maybe 2 years in the league. And that was even, he won the slam dunk contest, but he still played for 2 years and is gone. You never hear from him again. And Adam played for, I don't know, 8-10 years and was a very productive player, not a star, but really productive player. But so at the time, I knew that was going to be the reaction before I went down there, but you have to do what you think is the right thing to do for your franchise.
How much input, I know it's probably different today with all the analytics that come in, but back then when you were deciding whether to draft or make a trade, how much input and who was instrumental in helping you reach that decision?
Well, our basketball staff, we were all worked together. The coaches every year, I always would say to the coaches, you're welcome to join the research project that we're doing. But if you're going to do it, I need you to do it 100%, like full time. And we worked probably more hours than we should have. And we probably overdid it, looking back on it. But so the staff, our personnel staff, we worked together, and just we would try to see every game the player played his last season of competition, on tape, as well as the games we scouted in person. We did background checks, this is all common stuff. Other teams do the same thing. So the final decision comes down, the GM makes the final decision, but you're listening to the input of the people who have been helping you do the research, and you trust their basketball judgment. So, that's how we did it anyway.
Of all the transactions that you were involved in, which one do you think had the biggest, let's say, positive impact for the team that you were with then?
Well,
I know it's hard. You've been involved in a lot.
Yeah. Well, our drafts in San Diego, they didn't materialize because Sterling traded players away before, they had to be paid their second contract. But in 3 consecutive years, we drafted Tom Chambers, Terry Cummings, and Byron Scott.
Wow.
So we had, and now Byron never played for us because Sterling forced us to trade him to the Lakers because he was at a party, another Sterling offshoot. He was at a party with Jerry Buss. Sterling calls calls the office and he says, "Listen," and he was having trouble signing Byron because Sterling was really hard to negotiate with, and in fairness to the players. So Byron's sitting out. We're still in training camp, and Sterling calls and says, "Hey, listen, we can get Norm Nixon for Byron Scott, so make that trade." And I remember saying, "Well, yeah, Norm's a nice player, but he's at the end of his career. He may have a couple of years left. Byron's going to play. I can't promise you how good he's going to be, but I think he's going to be a really good player for 10 years. I mean, we don't want to do this. This is crazy." And he said, "No." He said, he forced us to make the trade. But anyway, so those 3 acquisitions I always felt really good about. Tom got traded away too early. Terry got traded away after I left to go to Denver. I think Mookie Blaylock worked out well. We traded Ramil Robinson for Mookie Blaylock, and Mookie ended up making the All-Star team and had a really good run with us. Acquiring Steve Smith and Grant Long was huge for our team at the time. Really great people who were the ultimate team players as well as good players. Signing Mutombo as a free agent helped us dramatically because we really needed to have a shot blocking presence in the middle. Picking up Laettner. We got Laettner, traded Andrew Lang for Christian Laettner, and Christian went on and made the All-Star team with us. So he had his best years with us, I thought. So I mean,
I know there's a lot there, and you seem to mention a lot of transactions that took place when you were with the Hawks. So am I safe to say that's one of your proudest, I guess, rebuild or retool? I know they don't like to use those
Yeah.
names.
Well, I felt good about us in Atlanta because when I got hired in 1990, I got hired by Stan Kasten, who was president and general manager, but Ted Turner, the owner, wanted him to hire a basketball GM, and that wasn't Stan's expertise. So that's how I got hired. But the unusual situation is normally you go in as a general manager, the former GM is no longer around. I'm going in and working for the former general manager who built the current team. So my job is walking on eggshells to retool this thing without offending anybody, you know. So it
I
took
guess that political science degree came in
yeah,
handy for
right.
you.
It comes with handy. So it took us 3 years, and my goal too was not to get bad to get good. I didn't want to like just trade away everybody and acquire draft picks and win 20 games a year because I'd been with the Clippers and it was just miserable life. I mean, just awful, to go out and lose night after night after night. So I said, let's stay as good as we can stay. Let's make the playoffs every year. But let's build our team with trades and free agency rather than the draft. And so we that's what we did in those 3 years. So at the end of 3 years, we hired Lenny Wilkens. We've kind of retooled the team, and we ended up with the best record in the East after 3 years. So that rebuild or retooling took us 3 years. But during those 3 years, we won about 50% of our games. So we were with 41, 42, 43 wins, right in that range. So we didn't get bad. We're treading water and squeaking into the playoffs in the seventh, eighth spot, maybe. But then we had the best record in the East in 93, 94 season. And, Lenny was huge in that. And the guys that we'd acquired played a part. But in Denver, I love my time in Denver, but we didn't make many changes in Denver because we had just a stable group of guys. The biggest trade was made the first year I got there, and Vince Brillo was the president and GM of the team he signed me to be director of player personnel the first year I was there, and Vince had been out of basketball for a number of years, and so he was asking advice on who we should get from Portland in trade of Kiki Vandeweghe, and we had a choice between Darnell Valentine or Fat Lever, and Vince didn't really know the players because, as I said, he'd been out of basketball for quite a while, and so I said, well, Fat Lever, without question. Darnell's a really good player. Fat doesn't play as many minutes as Darnell right now in Portland, but Fat's upside is off the charts. I mean, he can do everything. And then we got Wayne Cooper. So in that deal for Kiki, we got Wayne Cooper, who ended up being our starting center, Fat Lever, all-star point guard, Calvin Nat, all-star small forward, first-round draft pick, a second-round draft pick. So that deal was a monster deal, and we won the Midwest Division championship that year and went against the Lakers, the Showtime Lakers, in the Western Conference Finals, which was overachieving for us. But then we added Walter Davis later as a free agent, and we made subtle changes to the team, but we actually tried to keep it intact for the 6 years that I was there, and for the most part, we did.
Now, in your 40 plus years in the NBA, you saw a lot of evolution, right? The time when the Clippers were starting out to 2016 when you left. What do you think some of the biggest evolutionary changes to the game were?
Well, by far the biggest change, I think, has been the effect of analytics on the game in terms of the three-point shot, which I personally don't think is a good thing. I'm not anti-analytics. In fact, when I was in the San Diego Clippers, my dad was a computer programmer, and we worked with him and designed an analytic statistical analysis of players in the league, and we used it back in 1980 and 81. So we used it, but to me, analytics should be a piece of the puzzle and not the answer to everything. That when I say that it's been a little detrimental to the league, what I mean is that analytics has shown coaches mathematically a bad 3-point shot is better than a good 2-point shot. And so we got this preponderance of 3-point shots now. When the 3-point shot came into existence, I think the first 2 or 3 years that it existed, teams averaged like 2.4 attempts per game. That's teams, not individual players, because coaches only used it, down the stretch when you needed to score 3 points. And now the game has evolved where, so the Celtics in that game, in the playoffs, they missed 45 3-pointers, missed, not attempted. They missed 45. I think it's hurt the game in the sense that we don't have any low post play for the most part. There's not as much movement without the ball. It's screen and roll on the perimeter. 5 players get on the perimeter, and the middle's wide open. I just don't think that it's been that change in the game. To me, is disappointing. I don't personally think it's as much fun to watch as guys come down and just jack up 3-pointers. But like one of the best championship series I've seen recently was when Denver and Miami played a few years ago. Both those teams move well without the ball. They play inside out. They, because Jokic sets the tone for Denver.
Yep.
With his phenomenal passing and seeing open men. And if you play with him, if I move, I'm going to get the ball. But those two teams in that championship series, it was fun to me. It was fun to watch. It was almost like watching old school basketball. But so I think that's the biggest difference in the game. There are lots of other things too, but that's the biggest change.
Sure. You mentioned earlier you thought there would be difficulty signing Dominique to keep him in Atlanta, and I'm going to pop up the contract of Evan Mobley with the Cavs. Would you ever have imagined paying a player $57-61 million a year and him not being the highest paid player on the team?
Well, let's put it this way. When I was in Denver, when the salary cap came into existence, and the salary cap per team was, I think, $3.5 million. That's for team. God. That's for team. Okay. So things have dramatically changed. I mean, I know I never would have guessed the numbers would be where they are. It's unbelievable. I mean, I can remember when if a player signed $1 million contract, $1 million for 1 year, that was outrageous. I mean, that was like, hard to imagine.
How long did it take when the salary cap came in? How long did it take before you had somebody to start to manage that and look at that? In terms of being part of trades and your assessment of the team.
The salary cap itself is honestly not that complicated if you use it every day, and you're familiar with, but here's the formula for making a trade. This is what percent you have to be within, adding the numbers up. I mean, it's not really that complicated on the basis of it. Now you got all kinds of other things that come into play, but I would say in the beginning it wasn't too bad. What happened is that because we have a soft salary cap and you have all these ways you can go over your cap, you sign your own draft picks. Okay. And that can take you over the cap. We used to have what we called the $1 million exception. So you could always sign a player to $1 million, even if it took you over the cap. We had the mid-level exception back in those days where you could sign a player every year to the mid-level exception, whatever that mid-level salary would be. So you could always sign your own free agents and go over the salary cap. So having a soft cap, it wasn't long before we were all over the cap for the most part. A few exceptions, but most teams were over the cap. And then eventually that's why the tax had to come in, because the salary cap owners were saying, well, this will make us fiscally responsible. We should be fiscally responsible anyway, but this will keep it down, right? It wasn't working. And so they had to put a tax line in. And so there were owners that were then saying, well, look, okay, I'll go up to the tax, but I'm not paying a tax. So they tell their GMs, make any trades you want to make, do what you want to do, but you not go over the tax line. Because as you know, the original tax was $1 on $1. Now it's all scaled, but it was 100% tax, and owners would say, I'm not paying 100% tax. So I think that's when there was the biggest change. And then you had some owners, like when I was in Cleveland, I wasn't working in the front office. I was just scouting for them and helping them with player personnel, the draft. And but Dan Gilbert, he wanted to win a championship, and so he was basically giving his GMs free reign. I remember we signed Shaq. We made a trade. I think Danny Ferry made a trade for Shaq out of Phoenix because LeBron wanted Shaq added to the team. And Dan Gilbert basically, if I understood it correctly, told Danny, do it. I'll pay him his money. He's got a huge contract. I'll pay it, but don't give up any assets to get him. So Danny and Phoenix wanted to get off the contract. So Phoenix was motivated to move him, and Dan's willing to pay the contract. And Danny's traded him several players that added up to that number who we weren't going to have back. And so we got Shaq, and Dan was willing to pay his contract, even if it takes over the tax line, because LeBron felt it was important to have him. And then Shaq, unfortunately, was hurt an awful lot and didn't play much
Right.
at the very end of his career. But you get some owners who, they just want to win a championship, and they'll pay whatever it takes. But you get a lot of owners today that are pull the reins in a little bit because the numbers are getting so astronomical.
Yeah, take us back to the building of that 2016 Cleveland championship team. Can you shed some insight on maybe how that team was put together?
Oh, well, I'm trying to think now. So, well, first and foremost, LeBron came back from his vacation in Miami. So that was the number one thing that changed that team. But during his vacation, when we weren't very good, we were able to draft Kyrie, and Kyrie was terrific for us. Even though he's somewhat injury prone, he still was terrific for us. We were able to draft Tristan Thompson, who was not a numbers player, but a big time teammate, and did all the dirty work. He was really instrumental.
J.R. Smith.
And J.R. Smith, and acquiring J.R. and Kevin Love, bringing Kevin in, trading Wiggins, who was a good player, and David Griffin made a good decision because it was between Wiggins and Parker, and Wiggins has proven to be the better of the two in terms of making a pick. But then having David Griff making that move to trade Wiggins for Kevin, Kevin brought another element to the team we didn't have before. And then just the whole group of putting Richard Jefferson was great off the bench, and Channing Frye, and I'll lose track of her. Matthew Dellavedova was,
He
hard.
became a little icon there in Cleveland.
Oh, I mean, fans loved him. The opponents hated him, but fans loved him because he just left it out. I mean, you talk about a guy, the stereotype of leaving it all out on the floor. I mean, Delly flat out left it out on the floor. And I remember in the 2015 championship when we lost, I mean, Delly was just killing himself, covering Curry, and Delly was, I don't think he had anything left in the system, but the chemistry was great. The guys liked each other, played together well, and just you know, phenomenal effort. I mean, I very, in a very biased opinion, obviously, I thought we should have won in 2015. And I say that because of this. If we lost Kevin Love against Boston and that year, he got hurt, so he's done. Okay, we're playing Golden State in the finals. Game 1, we lead the whole game. I mean, we are really playing well, lead the whole game. They tie it up at the end of the game. We have a timeout, our ball, 24 seconds left, literally. And it's a tie score. We need 1 point to win the game. That's all we need. LeBron gets with inbound to LeBron. He catches the ball on the left wing, and for whatever reason, he just didn't do anything. I mean, he holds it and holds it and holds it, and if you just drive to the basket and get fouled, make one free throw, the game's over. But he ends up taking a fall away 3-pointer at the buzzer, and we have to go to overtime. We go into overtime. Kyrie fractures his kneecap in overtime. Now, maybe that never would have happened. Maybe it would have happened the next game. Who knows? But if we hadn't gone to overtime, maybe Kyrie stays healthy. We won game 2, even with Kyrie out. We don't have Kevin Love. We don't have Kyrie, and we win game 2. So my very biased opinion is we should have gone home 2-0 and started playing at home. But, that didn't happen. But fortunately, we came back and got it the next year.
Well, who was their big center? Boga? I remember him just at the top of the key with his hip check and sending Delhi flying constantly, no calls.
Yeah.
For that. That's the one thing I remember the most from that series, where I'm
Delhi
like, come on.
Delhi probably remembers that too.
He probably still has bruises from it.
Yeah,
but so you mentioned earlier that LeBron had voiced his opinion regarding the acquisition of Shaq. How much input did he have? How much input did Dan have in terms of who they wanted and whatnot? And how important was that to what you guys did?
Yeah. Well, so I wasn't involved with those conversations. Everything I was getting was talking, to Danny on the side. But Danny had an agreement with Dan Gilbert that he could call the shots basketball wise. So now I can't tell you if Dan was in his ear and saying this is what I wanted to do. I don't know the answer to that because I wasn't involved with it. But
Right.
But I know Danny had carte blanche and doing what he wanted to do with the team while he was the GM. So how much they talked to LeBron, I don't know. Because again, I wasn't in the GM's office. So I'm assuming they talked to him somewhat regularly about, things that he wanted to do. But I don't know the answer to it. I don't know.
Yep.
The GM would make the final call. And when Danny left, he was trying to negotiate. They were trying to negotiate a new deal, and I believe Dan wanted to have a little more input into what was going on. It is his team, obviously, so it's kind of a fair thing to want. But I don't know. So it wasn't like Danny got fired. They just
Right.
broke off negotiations and went their separate ways.
How common was it back when you were the GM and leading these teams for players to voice their input, saying, "Hey, get this guy, get that guy"?
Pretty rare. I never. Well, I shouldn't say never. I rarely would solicit the advice of a player. Occasionally, I would talk to somebody, like when we picked up Ken Norman from Milwaukee, because he and Dunleavy were kind of button heads in Milwaukee, and Mike wanted to move him, and so I called Danny Manning, who had played for us when we traded Dominique, and Danny had played with Norman with the Clippers. So I called Danny just to get his opinion, and he recommended him. And so occasionally I would check with a player, maybe who wasn't on our roster, but and again, it depends on who the player is, whether you listen to him or not. Oh, oh,
I
yeah,
won't even ask you which ones you didn't listen
yeah, you got
to.
to pick and choose who you listen to. Now, there were certainly players who would say to me, "Hey, you got to get so and so. He's a good friend of mine, and he could really help us." And I said, "Okay, yeah, fine." No, it's not happening.
Well, as storied as your career has been in the management, I think something even bigger that you've done is the life experience program. Is that fair to say?
It's one of the things that I feel really good about. Yeah.
Why don't you explain a little bit about, the concept behind it, what it is?
Well, what I wanted to do was I was always trying to find ways that we could help our players develop as people, not just basketball players, develop as human beings, good citizens, be well educated about what's going on in the world. So, started in Denver. I went to our owner in Denver, Sidney Schlenker, and I said, Sidney, I want to. This is before the salary cap. I said, I want to set up a program where we pay for our guys to go back to school. And he was great. He didn't blink an eye. He said, "Do it." And so I said, "So here's how I'll do it. Um, we'll go to the players, tell them if you want to go back and take classes, if you want to finish your degree, you want to get an advanced degree, you want to take interest classes, we'll pay for it. But the deal is, you come and tell me first you're doing it. You pay for everything up front. Uh, Once you pass the class, we'll reimburse you for everything, including supplies, whatever you need. Okay." But you got to pass. You don't have to get an A, but you got to pass. You can't drop out. You can't fail the class. And so we had players slowly took us up on it. We had maybe one or two players, and we had a player taking public speaking classes, and then pretty soon Mike Evans went back and got his degree, his bachelor's degree that he hadn't finished. And so that's how it started, and then it built. And so I thought, okay, we've got to provide our players with experiences off the court. So what I would do is when the schedule came out at the beginning of the year, I would sit down with our coaches and we'd figure out, we're not going to beat the players up with this. Well, let's do 2 a month, and we'll do them on the road so we don't infringe on a player's time at home with their families. And so what I would do is every city has got something special to offer. There's something historically, there's something of great interest, educational value. There's something in every city. So we go to Washington, D.C., for example, and it's got a ton of different possibilities. And one time I called Ford's Theater, where Lincoln was assassinated, and I said, could we have a private presentation? There's a park ranger who works there that's a great historian who gives a terrific talk on the Lincoln assassination. And so I said, could we have some time where it's closed, where we could go come and have like a couple hours? And they were great. They set it up. So we flew in like at 4 p.m. the day before the game. We would bus to the site. So we go to Ford's Theater before we go to the hotel, so we don't lose track of the guys right away. And I remember, I think it was Sharif said, I don't know if it was Sharif, I think it was Sharif who said to me as we were walking in, I understand the relevance of a lot of these, but I don't understand the relevance of this one. So I said, well, humor me. We're going to be here for an hour. At the end of the hour, you tell me if you think it's worthwhile for future teams or not. They said, okay, that's fair. So we go in. Park ranger gives this amazing talk that takes like 45 minutes. It goes through the whole thing with Booth and his co-conspirators and all these stories that most people don't really know the depth of all this, how it all came about. As we're leaving, well, Sharif ends up asking so many questions. We're there for like an extra hour. As we're walking out to the bus, I said, so I'm assuming you thought it was worthwhile. And he goes, oh, I mean, I knew Lincoln was assassinated. I didn't know the backstory of this whole thing. This is incredible. So my thought was the guys would never go to Ford's Theater on their own. Most of them won't. So let's expose them to something that has nothing to do with basketball, but just life in general. And we did that. We did Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, the Rain Motel where King was assassinated. We went to the most ambitious one is we went to NORAD in Colorado Springs, which is North American Air Defense Command, and it's underneath Cheyenne Mountain. And after 9/11, I don't know how, but I got an invitation when we play the Nuggets to bring the team there. Well, as it turns out, we're playing Denver in the last game of a long road trip, and the coaches were going to take a day off the day before the game anyway, because we're going to Denver for like 2.5 days. And so I said, well, rather than practice that day, which you're not going to do anyway, we'll take that practice time and we'll bus down to Colorado Springs. So that was the most challenging one, because you usually bus an hour one way, an hour back. But we had a movie on the bus for them and had stuff to eat. And afterwards, the visit at NORAD, these guys were blown away. Most of them didn't know NORAD would even existed. And now they knew the whole story. They were inside the mountain. They took us in this big room with this giant screen that tracked everything in the air in North America, and how they got them all down on 9/11 from there.
Wow.
And so, guys, next training camp guys were talking about it. So it's just, and I bring in speakers. John Lewis and I became good friends working in Atlanta together on different projects. And John was always great. If I said, can you have breakfast with our team when we're in Washington? He never said no. He always was very accommodating, and, would share with the guys his life experiences himself, working with Dr. King and the other civil rights leaders, and being one of the original freedom riders, and being beaten up on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And, just, and the whole idea, again, it was just to help our players be exposed to other things in life other than basketball. And we do try to do 2 a month. And, I run into former players today, and they'll still comment about some of those things. They'll go like, well, that one visit, whatever it was really stuck with me, So that was kind of the idea behind it.
That probably has a bigger impact on you than the basketball stuff with those guys, I think, in terms of how you feel about what you've accomplished.
Well, I feel really good about the program. And I remember talking to other GMs about doing the same kind of program, and some thought really understood it. And I sadly, there were some that would say to me, well, what's it to do with basketball? And I was like, no, you don't understand. That's not the point. It's like, helping our guys expand their horizons and be more well-rounded and become better educated about the world. That is, but anyway, it's one of the things I feel really good about that we did over the years.
Well, you know what, Pete? It sounds like you should write a book about all this.
Yeah, well, that was my phone was ringing. It was Wayne Embry.
Ah,
yeah, but I'll call him back.
awesome.
Yeah, I should write a book. In fact, I've got a book in the works. Hopefully, it's going to be out. We've got a printer lined up and book designer. The book is about the genesis of it was my daughters kept telling me over the years I should write a book about all these experiences behind the scenes in the NBA. And
Yep.
I had 2 brothers who were in the NBA, so the 3 of us, all our career, most of our adult lives were spent in the NBA. So just telling all those stories so our kids and grandkids would have them to keep. So that was the genesis of the whole thing. And then and I teach a class at Emory University in the winter each year called Civil Rights in the Game of Basketball. And the more I started thinking about it, and working with one of Red Auerbach's biographers, Ken Dooley, who's become a really good friend, he convinced me to rewrite the book, incorporating the civil rights movement and all the activism that we were involved with, using the vehicle of the NBA and basketball to get into these other areas. So we had anti-gang programs, we had all kinds of stuff. But anyway, so the book is called Courts of Justice: A Life in Basketball and Activism. And I try to tell the story of the history of the league and how it became integrated, and stories about those that really paid the price of integrating the league, and some of the good and bad, but also how the civil rights movement and basketball were kind of intertwined, and they fed off one another to a degree. So civil rights movement helped basketball. Basketball was a vehicle of bringing people together, which helped the civil rights movement. So, so that's the topic of the book, and we hope to have it released September 1st, is what we're shooting for.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to having that book released, and taking a good read through it. So, Pete, I really appreciate your time today. Fascinating. I could spend another hour or two talking to you, trying to get more of those stories out that you might not want to tell. But
No, hey, anytime you want to talk about the history of the league and all that. There's a lot of unknown stories about, how did Red Auerbach draft Chuck Cooper, and what's the backstory of that? And because I'm close friends with Red's biographer, he's told me all these stories that Red didn't want told until after he was gone. So a lot of these stories never been written before, but we include all those in the book. So, but anytime you want to talk about this stuff, I'm
I
happy to do
think,
it.
how about before the release, we have you back on, we get a little sneak preview of some of
Yeah,
those behind the scenes stories,
that'd be great.
and help you move some books maybe.
That'd be even better.
All right, Pete, I appreciate you. If you could just stick around, we're going to play some exit music. Thanks everyone for tuning in. The great Pete Babcock, and look forward to you. Everyone have a great week.